Cassy and Lauren here. First of all, I want to say thank you to Cassy for her broadcast last week. She went solo to talk about her son Wyatt and his Down syndrome, being the parent of a child with Down syndrome and all that entails and how it relates to our life as Catholics. Cassy's been doing a great job with the show and also managing our Twitter account. So if you haven't followed us on Twitter, our handle is @FidelisWomen. So this week we're coming to you for Holy Week. Today is Tuesday of Holy Week, the Triduum, which is technically like the end of Lent and the start of like the Passion, is going to start on Thursday. So Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday all together, those 3 days are called the Triduum. And then of course, Sunday is Easter. So today, Cassy and I wanted to talk about kind of just what we're entering into this week, and that's the passion, crucifixion, death, and burial of Jesus. And obviously that will culminate in the resurrection. So something that we thought was interesting about this is that Catholics tend to have a kind of a fixation on the passion and death of Jesus. And I think that's kind of unique to us. Like I haven't studied how all Protestants approach this. So there might be other traditions where there's a heavy emphasis on like the gory, violent details of Jesus's death. But it's something I personally really like about Catholicism. And I think that I was reflecting on like, why is it? Why do we gravitate so much toward it? And I think part of it, I'm sure there's many reasons and documents we could read on this, but like, I think part of it is like, as humans, we can identify with how much God loves us when we see what he went through physically, because we understand physical things. And it's hard to comprehend how much God loves you when in terms of like being a spiritual being, if that makes sense. So I think being able to see the violence that he was willing to undergo and the torture and the torment that he put up with just 100% for us is just a way to understand how much he loves us. And Catholicism really boils down to understanding how much God loves us and trying to love him in return, I guess you could say. So that is what we're going to talk about today. Cassy, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good.
Great. Well, one thing that Cassy and I talked about when we were discussing this episode was the different representations that we have to kind of understand what it was that Jesus went through. So obviously 2,000 years ago, we don't have like a recording that we can watch of the crucifixion. We have the gospel accounts, obviously, but those are not comprehensive. And then we have like mystics who have allegedly had visions of the Passion and crucifixion, like Anne Catherine Emmerich, whose writings kind of corroborate what we hear in the Gospels, and then that's what the Passion of the Christ movie is based on. So she kind of like fills in the gaps of the crucifixion. But then there's also the Shroud of Turin, which is believed to be the cloth that Jesus was wrapped in after he was taken down from the cross. So in the Jewish tradition, you're buried in a shroud after you die. And so this was the cloth that Jesus was buried in. And Cassy watched a really cool documentary about the Shroud of Turin. And in studying the shroud, we can learn a lot about what Jesus went through. And the shroud also corroborates what we read in the Gospels and that kind of thing. So Cassy, can you talk a little bit about that documentary? Because I haven't had a chance to watch it, but I really want to.
Yeah, so it's called The Real Face of Jesus, and it follows a graphic designer named Ray Downing and other researchers that examine the Shroud of Turin to try to, the end goal is basically to see what Jesus actually looked like, to take the image on the shroud and come up with the actual face of Jesus. But in the process, there's so much more that they learn. They really debunk a lot of the myths and the skepticism that's surrounding the shroud. Because there are always people that sit there and they say, there was that test that was run not too long ago that showed it dated back to the 1400s. And they actually have answers for all of these things, which is really interesting. But then it also really goes to show how the image on the shroud was not like painted. It wasn't even blood, it's, I can't really go into the specific scientific aspects of it, but it's a very interesting documentary. And it really, like I said, kind of gives validity to the Shroud of Turin being what it is. And on top of that, not only are they able to come up with a representation of what Jesus looked like, it also kind of delves into the crucifixion itself, because obviously the blood pattern of what happened is written on the shroud. And even then, at that point, when you stop and think about it, at this point, Jesus has been dead for a while. So his blood's not flowing anymore. It's dried to some extent. But even then, it still was enough that on the shroud, we're seeing, this just pattern of horrible, horrible abuse and violence all over his body. And there was even one scene I remember where he's looking at it and, he's saying this was someone who was just, like literally beaten to death, the amount of agony that he had to go through, and was just kind of overcome and had to stop for a minute and compose himself. Because I think it's hard for people, and I know it was for me for a long time, to remember, just how horrible his death really was. Especially, someone like me growing up in a Protestant church. It's all kind of very sanitized. And even when you think about the crucifixion, it's still not, you're not thinking of it as, you see it on, even crucifixes, and it's like, okay, well, there's nails in his hands, and yeah, that probably sucked, but no, this was literally, because it just, the scourging and then the crown of thorns and then having to carry the cross, the amount of just exhaustion alone from having to carry the cross itself, in addition to being under just this extreme physical pain, because it wasn't a whip with a couple straps of leather. Anyone who's seen the Passion of the Christ will know what I mean. This was literally ripping flesh away from his bones, and and then if you were to Google, and I can find some links and post them, the actual physiology of crucifixion, even aside from what all Jesus went through prior to that, it was a horrible, agonizing way to die. And regardless of, apparently not everyone had the little footstools or whatever you want to call it, that his feet were resting on. Not everyone had that. And I guess I'd have to look again, but it makes a difference as far as the manner of how you die, if you have that. Because with that, you get kind of tired out more because your arms are in pain. So your instinct is to push up on your feet to relieve the pain from your arms. But then when you do that, that causes more pain elsewhere. So then you go back down, and it's like this constant battle for pain and for just, to try to avoid that pain. And that's what he was enduring. And on one really interesting thing that I think of now every time I hear the story of the Passion, the Gospels, like this Sunday, was it talks about the strain it puts on your lungs. It would have been very hard to breathe. And every time you breathe, you would have had to push up on that footstool again. And in doing so, it would have been very painful, but that was the only way that you could talk or take a breath. And so talking would have been extraordinarily difficult. So the point in bringing that up is that the things that he says while he's on the cross, pardoning the other criminal, telling John and Mary, this is your son, this is your mother. And then, God, why have you abandoned me? Him saying these things, they were important. He made sure he would have had to endure this horrible pain, even more horrible pain on top of the already horrible pain, in order to say these things. And so it's kind of an indicator that these were important words that he was speaking. And so it's a really interesting documentary, and it just gives a lot of weight to the physical agony he would have suffered. And more than just showing us what his actual face looked like, and then, just the physiology of what he would have gone through was horrible. And I don't think we get the reality of that very often.
No, especially in the US, where criminals are executed by lethal injection. It's not like a cultural understanding that we have of what being tortured and killed in a violent way is in the United States. Let me plug in my earbuds.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Did
documentary, or I think I read somewhere a few years ago that like ultimately Jesus died of asphyxiation, like officially.
Yeah, something along those lines. Yeah, I'd have to double check again, but basically, yes, it kind of goes back into keeping in that, or the same type of thinking of, you know, it being hard to breathe. And you'd have to push up on your little footstool. And I think that's actually what it was. It kind of bears out to even more. Typically, men who were crucified didn't have that, and so they would asphyxiate more quickly. But with that footstool there, it kind of drags it out longer because you're able to keep yourself breathing for longer.
Yeah.
But it's also a miracle that he didn't die of blood loss. You know, he didn't go into hypoglycemic shock on top of all of that. And I do know there's a link from a doctor, I want to say maybe even a medical examiner, like a coroner, that talks about, and I'll find it and I'll post it, the physiology of what it would have been like for his body, what would have happened. That it would have been traumatic for his heart, it would have been traumatic for his lungs, was basically the point. And the breathing would have been very difficult, and that the harder it got for him to breathe, the more pressure it put on his lungs, they would have filled with liquid, and that he would have basically asphyxiated kind of from the outside in, if I'm remembering correctly.
That sounds right, because when they pierced his heart, the tradition is that blood and water came out, and I think that has to do with like the fluid around his lungs and everything. Yeah. We had like a display of the Shroud of Turin at the monastery that I lived in. And I think something I remember reading there, I haven't watched the whole documentary, I watched part of it. Something I remember reading was really cool, that like one of the ways that they kind of confirmed that the shroud was real was that they found like pollen samples that are unique to that region in the shroud, which I thought was so cool. Like there's so many ways that they kind of like confirmed that it was the real shroud. But part of the documentary that I did watch, we were talking about blood loss, and the expert that they were interviewing was like, I just couldn't get over how much blood was on the shroud. Like I just wasn't expecting it to be that much blood. It was so shocking. So that was really interesting. And I'm gonna post the link that you sent me. I'm trying to remember what the name of this documentary is. I'm looking for it.
It's The Real Face of Jesus.
Yeah, The Real Face of Jesus.
It was on the History Channel. And they usually air it a lot around this time too. I've noticed, you know, it'll be on TV pretty frequently around Easter. So I just have it on my DVR and I try to watch it, you know, at some point during Holy Week. But yeah, the amount of blood that he lost. And that's why I even mentioned the fact that, you know, when you stop and think about, okay, well, this is a few hours later, the blood's no longer running because the heart's no longer pumping. He's not still actively bleeding. And at this point, some of it would have dried, you know, but there's still that much. Yeah. There's still that much on the shroud. So it kind of just shows like how much, like it blows your mind, you know, and to think about someone being put through that, any person really, but then on top of that, you know, of all people, Jesus, it's horrible. And I think that's why when people watch The Passion of the Christ, they have such an emotional reaction, because seeing any person be tortured brutally is difficult. But then you're watching it and you go, he went through this for me and he did it for me and he willingly did it. He could have ended it at any time, but he willingly endured the entire time. And I know for me, I felt immense guilt the first time I watched The Passion.
Catholic guilt.
So I felt so horrible. I just sat there and I bawled, and I just felt like, who am I to deserve this? You know? Right.
It's cathartic, because it's almost like you have to go through that in order to come to the other side, where it's like, whoa, that's how much he loves us. And we're never going to even comprehend how much he does love us. That movie is really good. So the Real Face of Jesus, The Passion of the Christ, maybe meditating on a crucifix that's a little more graphic than the ones you typically see hanging in your sanctuary at church. Those are just some good like visual aids for this week as we enter into Holy Week. So Cassy and I were talking, and it's come to find out neither one of us had our like Lent go exactly how we planned. And I feel like that's how it always goes for me. But I always, my intentions for Lent never align with what I actually do. And so I'm kind of going into Holy Week. Like, I really want to take it seriously because the rest of Lent I just wasn't as faithful as I set out to be. And so I kind of was making a list for myself of things that have helped me in the past to enter into Holy Week. So I'm going to go through that here just to give some suggestions in case this is helpful for anyone else too. Always the graphic representations. I don't know if I'm just like super visual or if this is how everyone is, but the graphic things are really helpful to me during Holy Week. So that is one suggestion. Another suggestion would be to read either the gospel depictions of the passion and death of Jesus, or the Old Testament. I really love Isaiah 53 and the Old Testament prophecies about Jesus, because they align perfectly with what happened in the Passion, but there's something really cool about seeing the writings as a foreshadowing of what was going to happen. So kind of those two pieces of scripture are really helpful this week. What else? The sorrowful mysteries of the Rosary, the Stations of the Cross, the 7 last words of Jesus. And I don't want to just throw all these things out and have people feel like I can't do all of this. I mean, what I'm probably going to do is pick like one of the 7 last words of Jesus and like meditate on it for the week, or like one chapter of Isaiah. You know, I'm not going to like try to do all of this in the next few days. During the Triduum, which we talked about, which is Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday, there's usually services on Holy Thursday and Good Friday at church. So those you can attend. It's always hard for me to get to them because I have kids, but they're not required, but they're really good. If you can't, one thing that's really helpful, if you can't make it to those services and you have kids or whatever, the altar of repose is usually set up after the Good Friday service, or no, the Holy Thursday service. So if you want to go like late at night on Holy Thursday, your church might be open and have exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. So that is a good option if you want to make it into church, but you can't make it to a service. It's usually like open all night. And then after the Good Friday service, all of the Eucharist is consumed on that day, because the idea is that when Jesus dies, the earth is kind of desolate. God is dead. And so this isn't like a tradition that I'm familiar with at large in the church, but I really like visiting a church on Holy Saturday and just like feeling the desolation and kind of like meditating on how different the world is when the Eucharist isn't there and you can't just go and see Jesus at whim. It kind of makes you like realize that we take for granted the fact that he's there the rest of the year. So that's another thing that I like to do. And then Cassy, you had an idea for how kids could be involved. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, because watching the Passion of the Christ is, kind of the obvious, like make sure you watch it during Holy Week. But let's be realistic. I'm not going to show that movie to my children.
Right.
Maybe when they get older, but it's just way too, even if it weren't for the graphic violence, which I actually am not opposed to. I know a lot of people are, but I think it's good for us to have that kind of representation. But even that aside, it just, they don't understand. So even if the violence was something that they could understand, it's like they're too young to really get it. Mm-hmm. So when you're thinking about, well, how can I talk about it with my kids? The really easy solution is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because the allegory is literally Christ's death and resurrection.
Yeah.
And my kids, well, my oldest already does love Narnia. So you could either read the books to them or you could watch the movie. If your kids are maybe too young to be into chapter books, like Ben, my 7-year-old, he's a little bit too young for chapter books right now. So we would watch the movie. We probably will some point this week. And, I can kind of talk to him and tell him like, hey, this is just like Jesus, like Aslan went and died, to save the people of Narnia. And in so doing, by willingly giving his life, he was able to come back and save everyone. So it's a good representation without them having to watch a movie that's graphically violent or, that they won't understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great idea. I think I'm going to try to show it to my kids this week. My kids have never seen The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe movies at all, so they'll really enjoy that. They didn't really understand what was going on with Palm Sunday. They thought the palms were swords. And then at school, they learned like Hosanna and everything, but they still haven't quite put together what it means. So I'm thinking instead of like showing them the graphic violence of the Passion, like I might try to like put together a crown of thorns or something, and so we can just talk about like have a tangible representation of this is kind of what the soldiers put on Jesus's head or something like that, just to kind of introduce them little by little. But there's always that balance of like what is going to scandalize them and what is going to be like age appropriate. I'm still trying to figure it out, but I like the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe suggestion a lot.
Well, and a few other things like I remember seeing somewhere was having a silent hour on Good Friday between 3 and 4, the hour that Jesus died. That's something that I'm going to try to do. So like no TV and like turn off all the lights so that it's, you know, the house is kind of a little bit darker and it's a little bit more solemn.
Yeah.
And then on Holy Saturday, the idea is that it's not supposed to be like a happy day. You know, it's not a bad day, but you know, but you know, it's just kind of one of the, like, you want to kind of refrain from going out and doing fun things, maybe. You know, maybe go to your church, like Lauren said, or, you know, not that you have to mope around and cry all day, but just, you know, like for us, we're not really going to be doing much on Saturday. You know, normally on weekends, we try to go do something fun. We're not going to do that on Saturday because it's Holy Saturday. And not only is Jesus dead, but on Holy Saturday, where is he? He's in hell. So it's even more of a, you know, mourning situation because not only has he left the earth, he's descended into hell for us again. So, I mean, really like the suffering that he went through is very great. And, so on Holy Saturday, I think it's nice to kind of honor the solemnity of that day and, you know, just, you know, no parties or fun stuff or going out to eat. You know?
Right. That's good advice. Yeah. I really like what you said about turning off all the lights and having a as quiet hour as you can with little kids. I think that's a great idea. I've never done that before. And that seems like a very good alternative to going to the Good Friday service, because typically our kids are just totally oblivious to what's going on, and one of us goes to the service while the other one stays with the kids. And so we kind of like switch off every year who's going to go to the service this year, but then the kids don't really get to like enter into it. And so that's a great idea. I'm going to do that.
I will say that Benjamin has liked going to the Holy Thursday service in the past. I mean, not that he understands, but there's more for him to, I guess, look at maybe, you know, like with the priests watching the feet and then, you know, processing around the church and singing and then going into adoration, you know, he was able to tell him like, we're going to go and we're going to sit with Jesus. And so he's actually enjoyed that in the past. So I would say if there's a service that you do want to go to, I mean, my recommendation would be Holy Thursday and not Good Friday. So, but you know, whatever works best for you.
And then those who are like super on top of parenting, you could have like a Seder meal, but I'm not going to be able to do that.
Well, that's like somewhat controversial though, right? Like some people say we shouldn't do that. I don't know. I have no idea like what that entails. So I have like no opinion on this. I'm not.
Okay.
Like I see I like, have you seen that? There's like this debate I always see every now and then around Holy Week that like plays out whether Christians should have a Seder meal or not. And I see some people that are like, yes, because that's our heritage too. And then other people are like, no, that's a Jewish thing and you shouldn't do it. It's rude to Jewish people. And I'm like, I don't know.
I don't know. I've always thought it was awesome. And in college, I actually attended a Seder where it was a husband and wife who were actually divorced, but they're really good friends. And the wife is Catholic and the husband's Jewish. And so every year they like do a Seder, and it was really cool. I thought it was very enriching to me. And maybe like when I was little, I remember one time my family did a Seder where we just ate the foods, and like it was more of a symbolism type thing. But at the Seder that I attended in college, they actually read the Seder prayers and everything. So maybe, I don't know if the debate is over the meal at large, or if it's like people think we shouldn't be reading Jewish prayers. I don't know. I'm very much a salvationist from the Jews Catholic. So I don't know very much about this debate. So I'll refrain from commenting, but
I've never been to one. I have no idea like what it's like, you know? So I literally, I'm not saying this to say people shouldn't go to Seders.
Right.
I have no.
But that's good to know that there's a debate over it, because maybe it's not.
There's like this controversy over it, and I don't even know what it really is, and you know, I kind of have seen like both sides, and I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I have a child named Moses, so that story in scripture is like really close to my heart too. And so I think for me, it's just like a reflection on the Old Testament. But there might be reasons.
The Old Testament, you know, like those are Jewish teachings too, but it's also our, you know, I don't know. I don't even know what all it entails. So, you know, ultimately you do you.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. So, I mean, what the way that it's been approached when I've seen Catholics do it is that we're looking at the parallel between the meal that was had before the Hebrews fled Egypt, and the blood of the lamb was put on the doorpost and all of that. There's a parallel between that and then the Last Supper and the passion and death of Jesus. And so the Catholic approach to it is just that we're like looking at the parallel and how God fulfilled the covenant. But I would encourage people to just read about it and see like what the church writings are and everything. But the way that I've seen it approached hasn't been heretical or anything.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense the way you describe it. I had never heard of this being a thing ever until I started seeing a couple of years ago, like every year around Holy Week, there being these debates about, you know, Seder meals. And I'm just kind of like, I don't even know what this is.
It's like, oh, there's a debate about everything, but that one could be legit. I don't know.
That's a good point. Everyone debates everything now.
Yeah. That's what the internet is for, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's how it works generally. I mean, but the way that you describe it, like it makes sense if you're, you know, looking at it as a fulfillment of the covenant. Then I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, read about it. There you go, people. Just read about it before you do it. I think that's everything.
We were going to talk about like the Passion of the Christ too. I think a little bit.
Oh yeah,
the movie, because if you haven't seen it yet, make sure you go see it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yes, highly recommend. Very graphic, very not really kid friendly, depending on your kids. I don't know. But I didn't cry the first time I saw it because I was in a movie theater and I was like really self-conscious to cry in public. Oh. And then the second time I saw it, I was by myself and I was like basket case, lost it, couldn't control the sobbing, crying. So now I just watched it in little bits and pieces because I can't do the whole thing all at once.
I haven't, I saw it twice. Both times in theaters. And I was like sobbing. And I was there with like a group of people. And they were all just like, someone had the foresight. I think they'd seen it already. And that was how they knew, because they brought tissues. They were like handing them out to us, you know, like throughout the movie. But it was just, and I haven't seen it in a long time. I haven't seen it since I became a mom. And that's because I remember the movie. And I'm a little bit scared because I know that, you know, Mary features so prominently in it and they have the flashbacks back to his childhood. And I just know, you know, it was hard enough then. And now I'm a mom. Like every mom I've seen just kills me. And, you know, just regular movies. And then like, I remember there's one scene that even just thinking about it, like makes me upset. And that's when he falls carrying the cross and she flashes back to him falling as a child. Ugh, I can't do it. And we have it on DVD. I remember Matt like found it a couple weeks ago and he's like, do you still want to like keep this? Cause we've never watched it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yes, we need to keep it because we will eventually. I just have to get up the courage.
Yes. Yeah. People can rent it on YouTube if you don't have it. And like, I don't even have a DVD player, but it's like, I think it's $2.99 or something. It's really cheap, maybe $5.99. I don't know. I just remember looking at it and being like, wow, that's cheap. You can rent it on YouTube and watch it. And another cool option, if you're like us and you've seen it and you can't put yourself through that, there's like, obviously you can use Google Images to look up the images, but there's like photo books that are stills from the movies. And a long time ago, I framed some of those. And so I have like Jesus's feet during the crucifixion is like framed on my wall. I have this, like, it's very powerful for me to like meditate on just like a little snippet of the crucifixion. So if you can't handle the whole dramatic movie, just maybe pull some of the photos, like the photo of Mary Magdalene and Our Lady, like wiping up his blood after the scourging is, I feel like that's a really powerful reflection, even though Jesus isn't even in the picture. There's so many powerful movie stills, the agony in the garden. What else? The actual crucifixion, him talking to the two thieves on either side of him, the flashbacks to his childhood, John and Mary Magdalene being at his feet during the crucifixion. And then obviously the image of the Pietà. Oh, that's another thing I wanted to mention, that like image of Mary holding Jesus after he's taken down from the cross. And the acting is so good in the movie of Mary holding Jesus. And you just see her, she's just like spent and desolate and in despair, but not despair, because despair is a bad thing that Mary didn't probably experience. It means that you've like lost your hope in God, but just this total like loss that she feels. She acts it so well. And so there's just a lot of good images if you want to pull an image instead of watching the movie.
Yeah, and I remember that movie being controversial when it came out too, because people complained about how graphic the violence was. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I kind of get where they're coming from, because in most other movies, there's this whole category to torture porn, and it's like an actual thing. And most of those movies are really, truly disgusting because there's it's just like the Hostel movies and so on. Like, really, it's just torturing people in a movie just because they can. So it's like, I kind of get where, especially like if you're a secular, like coming from a secular source and maybe you weren't religious, you weren't Christian or something. I can kind of get where they're coming from. But the thing is that, I mean, really that was the only accurate depiction of what Jesus went through.
Right.
I can't think of any other. And even though, I mean, you could sit there and like, you could argue, oh, well, it's based on Anne Emmerich's, visions. So some of it is, kind of
fill in the blank, fill in the gap type thing.
Blank, But the actual physiology of what happened during the crucifixion, that part was accurate. That was accurate. So, I mean, I feel like it was something that was necessary. It was something that was needed. We needed to be able to see what he went through, what he endured, because how can you really grasp the level of sacrifice that he made for us if you don't know what kind of sacrifice he made for us?
Right. Yeah. And the movie only shows the physical suffering. I mean, if anything, the movie doesn't show enough because there's no way to show the spiritual agony he was going through. And that was even worse than the physical. So I 1000% think it's great, but maybe the Passion of the Christ is the only like legitimate depiction of that type of violence. I mean, it's more of a documentary than even a fictionalized, torture porn or whatever. It's just showing something that historically happened.
Well, and it's funny because, like you mentioned, there's no way to show his emotional agony, but even some of the, I'm pretty sure this is in the link that I'm going to post. I'll have to double check. But like when he's in the garden, he has the agony in the garden, and it says in the Bible that he was so agonized that he was sweating blood.
Yeah, that's a thing. That's actually a thing.
That's apparently like a real physiological phenomenon that happens. And I want to say it's under extreme duress.
Yeah, I saw it happen to someone before.
So it's, I had never, I mean, it's not that I doubted it. It's just, I'd never, there's a lot of medical stuff I probably don't know.
Yeah. I think, the Passion does a really good job showing a lot of things that I think none of us ever thought about. Like Jim Caviezel got hypothermia, which is something that very possibly could have happened to Jesus and maybe did. I don't know like what the science is on it. He also, 2 times he was actually scourged when they were filming the scourging at the pillar. So the makeup artists actually based the rips and tears in Jesus's skin on the actual scourgings that Jim Caviezel received, because it actually tore his skin out. And so it's so accurate. So good.
And he got struck by lightning twice too during filming.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's amazing he survived that movie.
Yeah. And I mean, it's an important movie, and I get why people, feel like the violence is over the top, and I get why it's not something you can watch all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I still feel like it's important. It's an important movie. I'm glad that it was made, and I don't feel like it was. I mean, it wasn't fake. Mm-hmm. It wasn't fake. That was how it was. So, I mean, if anything, like if you're watching that and feeling like this is so horrible, Mel Gibson, how could you do this? Then it's like, well,
right. All he did was show what happened.
Another sign of like what Protestants are missing, because of like what I said. How can you truly? Because in Protestant churches, so much of the crucifixion is kind of sanitized, if it's even alluded to. A lot of churches, and I mean, this isn't all of them. There's so many different denominations. Each one is going to be different, but largely, in my experience, they tend to just kind of either completely ignore the crucifixion and they only focus on the resurrection, or if they do acknowledge the crucifixion, it's like very like that's why you see the empty crosses a lot. They don't even put Jesus on the cross.
Yeah.
And it's just, it's very cleaned up, and it's just, you watch something like The Passion, and it just, how again, the same thing. How can you truly understand the depth of the sacrifice that he made for us if you don't even know what kind of sacrifice it was? Right. If you ignore that sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure there's denominations that cover that more, but in my experience too, like down in the South, I haven't seen any Protestant churches that have I don't think they typically use crucifixes at all because of the statue thing, which we won't get into. But yeah, I haven't really seen any sermons on details about the crucifixion or anything. So I love that that's something we focus on. We've talked about this before, but it makes it's really consoling to be able to know that whatever you're going through physically or spiritually, Jesus has been through worse. And so he can identify, and Mary, they can identify with whatever suffering that you experience whatsoever. So just to have that and to be able to have the depiction and understanding of a little piece of knowledge of how much he loves us, because we'll never comprehend it fully, but it's really important, and it's really beautiful that the Triduum is such a beautiful liturgy in the church, where we actually are kind of the church is kind of come on, we're going to do this. We're going to go through this, and we're going to talk about the cross, and we're going to talk about Jesus' suffering. And these things are not comfortable, but this is part of our faith. And then on Easter, it's everyone drink wine and have a party.
Yeah, exactly. It makes it that much more exciting when, you get to Easter. And I don't want to say that Easter is shallow, but I mean, it just, I don't know, without that, there's just not the same amount of joy if you're not living through that sacrifice, because there's no, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And that's what makes the Easter Vigil so incredible too, I mean, any Easter Mass is great, obviously, but there's something special about the Vigil, You start on the outside of the church with the fire and the candle, and everyone processes in, and the church is dark, and then all the lights go on and the bells are ringing and you're singing the Hallelujah. And it's amazing.
Yep.
It's this emotional, especially after the Triduum, like you said, it's this emotional rush.
Yes. It's so beautiful. I mean, if you have the ability and you've never done it before, go to the whole Triduum and then go to the Easter Vigil. It's just an amazing experience to walk through that whole 4-day process, really. Easter just comes full circle and comes alive if you can do that. But yeah, hopefully we've provided some helpful suggestions that we're also going to do too for those of us that can't necessarily be at church for the whole 3 days or go to the Easter Vigil. Oh my gosh, my kids would be banshees if I took them to the Easter Vigil one day.
We're not even going to attempt that anytime soon. Yeah. It's not even going to happen. One day.
But it is a beautiful mass. Yeah, one day. I really like being up late on Holy Saturday and like decorating the house for Easter for my kids and stuff. That's like a way that I try to be, and then I'll try to be thinking about what's going on at the vigil right now. But I haven't been to the vigil since I had kids. So one of these days.
Well, another thing, I mean, I don't know if like everyone's parish, I'm sure that a lot of parishes do. But our parish, you know, they're having decorations on Saturday, you know, like come and start preparing the church for, you know, Easter.
Yeah.
And they asked, you know, anyone that wants to volunteer, you know, please come and help. So I feel like that's
cool.
kind of a good, you're kind of working and you're making a little kind of tiny sacrifice of your time and your, you know, efforts, but then at the same time you're preparing for Easter. So I was like, oh, that's kind of like a cool thing. And so my husband actually had mentioned that like him and my 7-year-old might go and do that. So that's something you can do if you have like a bit of an older child. That is able to take good direction or, you know, work a little bit. Like that's something, if your parish does something like that, that you could do too. And
that's a great idea.
We're getting ready for Jesus to come. Jesus is about to, you know, rise from the dead soon. And so we're preparing for him. Or even if you do that around your house too, actually, for that matter.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I know. We'll have to do another show. So next week when we do our show, it will just be at the beginning of Easter season. So there's going to be like the whole octave of Easter. It's not just Easter Sunday. And then there will be like the whole 40 days till, is it 40 days till Pentecost or 50 days? Anyways, there's like a while till Pentecost. So next time we can actually do like a show on how we're celebrating Easter. Or we can include that in whatever the show is, because there's like lots more to talk about there. But for our Holy Week episode, I think that's everything that we wanted to cover. If you have any suggestions for how you're entering into Holy Week, we would love to hear them, and we will share comments. I'm also going to look for a Father Mike video that we can share, because I'm sure there's a good one on Holy Week. I'm pretty sure I've seen some. Yeah. And then Father Mike, you can retweet us again, because we get a kick out of it every time you do.
I know you guys would like, seriously, because like Lauren said, I'm the one that always runs the Twitter account, and every time like I at Father Mike, he'll, you know, retweet it, and I'm always like fangirling to Lauren, you know, oh my gosh,
Father Mike retweeted us. We love it. Love it. Yeah. Okay. So that's everything. Cassy, anything else to add that I forgot?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right. So everyone, have a great Holy Week. We'll be praying for you. Please pray for us. And we will see you sometime next week. So happy Easter in advance, but I'm reserving that. So just make it effective on Saturday night. All right. Bye, everybody.